Okay, the book is called Hidden Chicago Landmarks, and it's about the things that you don't find on the usual tour, the landmarks that have been forgotten or neglected or never were. And I got started on this actually about 30 years ago. I bought my first house, actually close to 40 years ago. Bought my first house in Oak Park, in the southern part of Oak Park, south of the Eisenhower, which the snobs north of the expressway call North Berwyn, around Roosevelt and Harlem. And it was a nice little house. But up the block, among all these little frame houses, there was this one magnificent brick structure on the northwest corner of Winona and Fillmore. And I wondered about that for a while, and then I gradually talked to my neighbors about it as I got to know them, and I found out, gee, this house had an interesting story. And that's really kind of got me started on these things. But we'll get to this mystery house later. Now, one of the landmarks in Chicago, I'm going to show you a picture of in a moment, is the theater on Lincoln Avenue, the Biograph Theater, which is famous in Chicago gangland tours. And the Biograph Theater is famous because that was the place where the feds nabbed John Dillinger, actually killed him in 1934. And John Dillinger, if you don't recall, was America's bank robber. And he'd gotten a reputation in the Depression. He'd robbed from the rich, gave to the poor, and it didn't seem to matter that his gang had killed 20 people along the way. Dillinger had a nose for publicity, and he was a good-looking young fellow. He was very affable when he was captured, and then he made a daring escape from jail with there are different stories, a wooden gun or whatever it was. Well, we're trying to save, here's pictures from the next book here. There's the Biograph. Okay, well, anyway, the feds killed Dillinger outside the Biograph after they got a tip. But Dillinger was such a celebrity at the time that after they took his body away, people were going into the alley and sopping up his blood in handkerchiefs. But anyway, that's Dillinger. Well, 21 years later, my story in the book is about the greatest manhunt in Chicago history since Dillinger. And this was about a man by the name of Richard Carpenter. Now, Richard Carpenter was a little Chicago punk, young Chicago punk, and he had a very bad background. He'd shot his mother once by mistake and served jail time. He had dishonorable discharge from the Army. And by 1955, he was the suspect in something like 100 small-time burglaries and robberies on the north side of the city. That's a house over there where he was captured on Potomac Avenue, as I said, around Division Street and Western. Well, then what happened was a policeman spotted him on a subway train, arrested him, was going to take him into custody, and while the cop was distracted, Carpenter pulled out a gun, killed the cop, ran up the subway steps, commandeered a car at gunpoint, took off. Well, now the police were really incensed. One of their own had been killed, and they sent this huge dragnet over the city. What had happened to Richard Carpenter? What had happened to this man? And people were looking for this. This was 1955. This was the early days of television. And TV came out with reports. What's happening to Carpenter? What's going on with cop killer Carpenter? Where is he? He just disappeared in the city. And I remember when I was a kid, parents used to use him as a boogeyman, saying, you know, I don't care if you want to come and stay out 10 minutes longer. You come in now, or Carpenter's going to get you. Well, finally, cop went to a movie theater on Division Street, the Biltmore Theater. And while he was coming out, he was with his wife. He saw somebody who looked like Carpenter. So he sent his wife out, and then he woke up this guy in the back, and it was Carpenter. The cop put him under arrest, but there was a struggle, and Carpenter managed to escape, and he got away. And there were gunshots in the theater. Carpenter gets away again. Well, what happened was that Carpenter had been wounded, and he kind of limps over to Potomac Avenue. He finds this house. He breaks into the house, and he takes this truck driver and his wife and the kids prisoners. And time goes by, and Carpenter's trying to figure out, well, what's he going to do next? Well, he kind of lets his guard down, and he lets the wife take the kids out, and he lets the truck driver get out, and so they notify the cops, and the cops come, and they surround the house. And like thousands of people gathered out there. Literally, they said like 2,000 people on the street. And he's in the apartment over here. This one here, of course, from the picture. And the cops gather around and they get on the bullhorn. Carpenter, come out, or your hands up. And the carpenter tries to get away again, but this time there are more gunshots. And the cops get their man. And well, Carpenter thought he was going to be a bad boy folk hero like Dillinger. Didn't work out. As they're taking him away, the people on the street started yelling, kill him, kill him, kill him. And he was executed a few years later. So that was Richard Carpenter, the biggest manhunt in Chicago since Dillinger. You remember this, right? Downtown, 1968 convention, gathered around that statue there. Okay? Well, who's that statue? And why is there a hump over here? Why is it built up like that? That's another Chicago story. That's General John Logan. He was a hero of the Civil War. He started the Memorial Day in the United States. And he died. He was even became a senator. He was a nominee for vice president, but he lost the election. Well, John Logan became another one of these New York versus Chicago rivalries in the 1880s because Ulysses S. Grant, you remember the big Civil War general, he'd been a native of Illinois, a resident of Illinois, and he died in New York State. So now New York City was building a tomb for General Grant. Well, when Logan died, the Chicago boosters figured, we're going to build an even better tomb for John Logan. Okay? Well, to make a long story short, you know, for a while they designed the tomb. They designed this, put this hill up there. They got a statue. Augustus St. Gaudens made this statue over here, and the tomb was going to go under it. And as I said, to make a long story short, Mrs. Logan finally decided, well, we're going to keep the general. We're going to keep him in Washington, D.C. where he was, because when she'd been widowed, she'd had a new career. She didn't particularly want to go back to Chicago. She liked living in Washington, D.C. So the general stayed where he was, and that hump over there stayed in Grant Park. And that's why there's that hump over there. That was going to be Logan's tomb. Never was. Okay, you recognize this? The post office. Well, we're talking about the street more than the post office, because you remember a few years ago the Circle Interchange was named after Jane Byrne? Well, a lot of people probably don't know, but that bridge is named after Clarence Wagner. Now, who was Clarence Wagner? Anybody know? Clarence Wagner was an alderman on the South Side. 1953, he was an alderman. And that's him. And the mayor then was Martin Kennelly. And Kennelly was a weak mayor. The alderman ran the city, really. Alderman Wagner really ran the city. Well, in 1955, the leaders of the Democratic Party had enough of Kennelly. They figured he was kind of a loose cannon. And then the Central Committee had a meeting, and it turned out that Richard J. Daley, who was a rising star in the party, was going to be named the head of the committee, and he was going to be nominated for mayor, and he was going to run everything, was going to be fine. Well, they had this closed-door meeting, and Clarence Wagner stands up and he said, well, wait a minute, let's delay this. We shouldn't have this meeting. You know, we should talk about this some more. So all the reporters are waiting outside. They've kind of been tipped off what's going to happen. They come out of the meeting, and they say, well, what's going on? And Daley kind of glum and said, well, we're going to have another meeting next week, in a couple of weeks. Well, Wagner probably figured out, why should Daley become mayor? Maybe I should be mayor, right? Well, they got the couple of weeks to organize. So Clarence Wagner goes off, and his teenage son and another politician, they go north to Minnesota, and he gets in a traffic accident, he gets killed. So Richard J. Daley becomes the nominee. He becomes the mayor, and Clarence Wagner is kind of forgotten. Of course, the Daley dynasty has started. But there was another dynasty that actually started with his death. There was when Wagner was killed, there was another person. His next in command in the 14th Ward was a man by the name of Joseph Burke. And Joseph Burke became the committeeman. A few years later, Joseph Burke dies, And his son becomes the new committeeman. You're nodding? Right, Ed Burke. So Ed Burke became the committeeman, and that dynasty started also because of Clarence Wagner's death over here. So that bridge was renamed after Clarence Wagner, and I guess people, you know, I always thought it was kind of strange to name an expressway bridge after somebody's killed in a traffic accident, but they did anyway. And the thing is, there is a plaque to him, to Clarence Wagner on the bridge house, and Alderman Burke came out, and I actually wrote about this on my blog, and then a few months later, Alderman Burke came out and they rededicated the bridge, and I like to think I influenced them, but probably not. Anyway, if you want to go see the bridge, it's on the bridge house. They got a little plaque for Clarence Wagner over there. South Bridge House. Now, this house over here, who does this house belong to? Now you recognize him? Sam Giancana. That was Sam Giancana's house. And if you don't know who Sam Giancana was, he was the head of the outfit. Okay, he was the head of the mob in Chicago. And he was killed in the basement of that house. Okay? And when I moved into the neighborhood, you know, I remember the murder because I moved in 1978 and he'd been killed in, I think it was 75, 76. And I remember the murder, and I was there for a while. And I finally was told, yeah, that's Giancana's house over there. And, you know, I asked my neighbors about Giancana, and, you know, they told me, well, you know, he didn't bother us, and we sure didn't bother him. And the one thing they did say about Giancana is they missed him, because they had these FBI men who used to keep his place under surveillance 24/7, and that way the neighborhood felt a lot safer. So that's a hidden landmark. You're not going to find this on any Oak Park tours, believe me. Now, another one of my books, On This Day in Chicago History. Okay, this one I did in 2014, I think it was, and this one, 366 Days of Chicago History. Historic event for each day. Now, I already knew what happened on September 11th in 2001, right? Attack on the World Trade Center and so on. So I decided, being contrary sort, I decided I would look up what happened exactly 100 years before that. What was the big newspaper story in Chicago, September 11th, 1901? And it turned out that the big story, believe it or not, was that the most dangerous terrorist in the United States had been captured in Chicago on Sheffield Avenue, 100 years to the day. And who was this dangerous terrorist that had been captured? Not Giancana. Sorry, wrong way. Emma Goldman. You see, what had happened is President William McKinley had been in Buffalo a few days earlier, on September 8th or something like that, and McKinley had gotten shot and he was killed. And they caught the guy that killed him right away, a guy named Leon Zolgotz, and they asked Zolgotz, why did you shoot the president? And he was an anarchist. He said, well, I heard Emma Goldman speak, you know, a few months ago, so, must be Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman is behind this. So there's this big conspiracy thing that, and the Chicago cops and everybody looking for Emma Goldman. Where's Emma Goldman? We got a tip she's in St. Louis. No, she's coming back to Chicago. So they stake out all of her places where she hung out, all of her known haunts, and finally this place on Sheffield Avenue. They stake it out, and one night, a few nights, September 10th, they see this little lady going into the house, and it looks like Goldman. And then the next day, the cops, well, later that night, rather, cops raid the place, and they say, you're Emma Goldman, you're under arrest. Well, I'm not Emma Goldman, but, you know, she finally admitted it. And she submitted to arrest because she figured she'd have a better chance to get her views before the public. Well, this is the place where they captured her, and it's on Sheffield Avenue. It's around, I got the exact address in the book, it's around somewhere around the 2100 block. And it turned out she didn't have anything to do with conspiracy. It was just this, she had met this guy Zolgotz and talked to him for a little bit, so they finally had to let her go. And eventually she was deported in the Red Scare of 1919, but she actually was brought back after she died, and she's buried out in one of the western suburbs. Now, any of you ever watched the TV program The Murdoch Mysteries? Okay. Murdoch Mysteries is a fictionalized series about a detective in Toronto around the turn of the 20th century. And one of the episodes was, after McKinley's shooting, Emma Goldman is captured in Toronto. You know, they for they kind of changed it around for production values, made it seem like it'd work out better to have her actually in Toronto. And no, didn't happen in Toronto. If you want to see where it happens, you go to this place in Chicago here. This is Chicago's smallest cemetery. This is a scrapyard, actually. There's a guy by the name of Andreas von Zerngebel. Okay, he came to Chicago, and he'd been fighting in wars in Europe, and he was a fisherman, and he staked out a place in Chicago during the 1830s, I believe, 1840s. I get the date in there. Anyway, around this, what's today around 93rd Street and the mouth of the Calumet River. Well, Andreas died, and they buried him on the property over there, and they supposedly had a deed to the property. And time went by, and gradually this property became more and more desirable. Well, Andreas's relatives, his descendants, had been visiting his grave for many years. And they got into a whole big legal dispute over this canal company that thought it owned the land. And they said, no, Andreas owned the land. He paid gold for it. Well, where's the deed? Oh, the deed got lost in the Chicago fire. Well, to make, again, a long story short, a settlement was reached. Andreas stayed where he is, and his descendants got a right to continue to visit his grave. And so his grave now, at first it was just like a little wooden cross, but it got knocked over by workmen. So they put these big blocks around it. And there's the grave. And there's his tombstone. Yeah, 1897, 1855. Yeah, Battle of Waterloo veteran. They got the wrong year for the Battle of Waterloo. It was 1815, but that's small potatoes, I guess. So today, his grave is still there. But it's an active scrapyard. It's around 93rd and Ewing. So access is limited, unless you're a descendant of Andreas von Zerngebel. It's another hidden landmark. Okay. A Night at the Opera, Marx Brothers film. Okay, Groucho was trying to smuggle these guys in from Italy. And they disguised them as these famous aviators. Well, this film was 1935, and in 1935, everybody, Italian aviators. You must mean who? Balbo. Italo Balbo. This man. 1934 World's Fair. Italo Balbo was a bigwig in the fascist government Mussolini. He led a squadron of seaplanes to the Chicago World's Fair, and they landed off the lakefront. And for the next few days, the city became Balbo crazy. And they did everything, the banquets and parades and everything else. And they named 7th Street Balbo Drive, and he finally went back to Italy. Well, as it turned out, Balbo, he was a true believer in fascism. He wasn't one of these guys that just kind of played along. No, he believed in it. So there's been a lot of calls to change the name of the street. One thing, though, a year afterwards, Mussolini sent this temple column over here as a goodwill gesture to the city of Chicago. And that temple column was thousands of years old. And the nasty thing about it, there's an inscription on it that says it's a gift of Benito Mussolini in the 12th year of the fascist era. And so there are a lot of calls to get rid of this thing. Well, this temple column, it was there before Mussolini, right? My solution is just put a sign over to Mussolini stuff and leave the thing there. Anyway, and that temple column is still there. It's right near Soldier Field. And with the Bears gone, it ought to be easy to get it now. Now, Mrs. O'Leary in Chicago Fire. What would you do if your mother destroyed Chicago? What would you do? That was the thing that little Jimmy O'Leary had. He's like 6 years old, and the fire comes, and everybody blames it on his mom. Your mom, it started in your mind. She destroyed the city of Chicago. What would you do if you were little Jimmy O'Leary? What you would do is you grow up and you become Big Jim O'Leary, the gambling king of the stockyards. And he was, as I said, he's a gambler. He had a resort on the south side, and but he paid off the right people, and he kind of operated in the open. And he got a reputation as an election seer. They didn't have public opinion polls then, so before every election, reporters would come down to this place. It was around 40th and Halsted, near the stockyards, and they asked Big Jim, who's going to win the election? And he'd go through all these things. Oh, this guy's going to win, or that guy's going to win. And he did it often enough so people would respect him. Well, Big Jim had a couple of other things going besides his resort. He had a gambling ship in a lake for a while. He had a amusement park called Luna Park. He even had a suburban. He went to the suburbs too. He was ahead of time. He had a suburban gambling place, and he had special gamblers trains that went back and forth to this place. Well, Big Jim died. Well, before he died, he built this mansion, and this is on Garfield Boulevard, and it's around Garfield Boulevard and Indiana Avenue, that area. And it was built by the architect who built the ballparks in Chicago, actually. And you can see when I took this picture, they were already trying to renovate this place because the neighborhood has gone through some tough times. But Big Jim's house is still there on Garfield Boulevard. Now, high eccentric hotel. It's the hotel in the Loop. And this door over here, some people are nodding. You know what's behind that door? What's behind the door? The cow path, right. Again, this land over here, the original settler, and I'm trying to remember his name over here because I get confused with a lot of these things. Okay. Anyway. The original man that bought this land. He had he used to take his cows. This is around Monroe and Clark, by the way. Monroe and Dearborn. He used to take his cows to graze around where the Board of Trade is. Well, when he sold off part of the land, he was granted, and he made sure in the deed of sale that it had a right for a right-of-way, an easement, to go through the property that he sold off so he could take his cows to go to graze. Well, time went by. A couple of different people, the property was sold off and bought off. And in the 1920s, they were going to build a building there. And then the property owners said, hey, wait a minute. The property owners to the north said, hey, wait a minute. We've got this area over here. We can really make some money. Okay, the property owners to the north when they wanted to build this building here. Yeah, so we'll get into negotiating with them, and they can pay us large figures. Well, the architect went back and said, they're not going to do that. All we'll do is we'll cut a little hole through the building. We'll just change the building, and they got this little path through the building. And the path is still there. For a while, they even had a plaque on the building. But you can still go down there. You can walk through the car path. It's supposed to be a public right-of-way as far as I was concerned. They let me in here to take the pictures. I went there. I was on Justin Kaufman's radio program when we went in there. We took some pictures. So I guess, if you want to walk around, you can probably do it. As you can see, it's not that interesting, but it is there. Who is this all-American boy? Wow, look at him. 1942 is an FBI mugshot? What happened to this guy? This is Herbie Haupt. Herbie Haupt was born in Germany, came to the United States as a young man with his parents, became a U.S. citizen, went to Lane Tech, and then around the time when World War II started, he somehow wound up back in German territory. And he became part of a plot called Operation Pistorius that Adolf Hitler personally approved. They had these Germans who spoke perfect English, knew American customs. They were going to come back to America, and they were going to be smuggled in, and they were going to carry out all kinds of terrorist activities. Well, as it turned out, two of the men in the plot dropped out, and they went to the FBI, and they told on the other people. And so Herbie Haupt 1942, all of a sudden he had signed up and showed up back at his parents' house here, which is on Fremont Street around DePaul University. He showed up at their apartment, and where was Herbie for a couple of years? Well, they didn't ask and he didn't tell. And he started dating a neighborhood girl, and he seemed to have a lot of money, and one day he gets in his new Pontiac, he starts to drive away, turns around, and under the L on Webster Street, these cars come, FBI, they put him under arrest, okay? So they put Herbie on trial. Herbie's a U.S. citizen. He's a naturalized U.S. citizen. But it was the time of war. And under the rules of wartime, President Roosevelt ordered him and the others tried as unlawful combatants by a military court. Military court found him guilty. Herbie Haupt, U.S. citizen Herbie Haupt, who had actually been in ROTC for a while, he was executed in the electric chair along with 6 of the other Germans. The 2 that dropped out, Roosevelt gave him prison time instead. So that's still a case that was still being argued a few years ago about the detainees that were down in Cuba. This was used as a precedent one way or the other, the argument. But that was Herbie Haupt. And that was the house where he spent his last minutes of freedom. Now you know this place, so I don't have to talk about this one. This is where we are. You should recognize this one. This is the Rinker House. And when I was a kid, I grew up on the Northwest Side, and I had friends out in the neighborhood here, and there used to be gross we call the Lilac Farm. And this was behind the Lilac Farm at Devon and Milwaukee. And we used to say, oh, that's the haunted house or something. Well, as it turned out, in the late 70s, they discovered this was one of the oldest houses in Chicago. And they put the announcements on it, placards. This is a historic house. And it got bulldozed anyway, by mistake. So that's the Rinker House. That's one of the lost landmarks. Frank Buck. Now, when Frank Buck died in 1950, he was one of the most famous people in the world, actually. He was a hunter, but he did not kill animals. His slogan was bring them back alive, and that's what he did. He went out and he captured exotic beasts for the movies, for zoos, and for other places. But Frank Buck, before he became famous, he was a Texan. He moved up to Chicago, and he lived in Chicago for a while on the north side. And he suddenly made the newspapers in 1901 when he married a celebrity. That's Frank on the right. And that's his new bride. She was Amy Leslie. She was a newspaper columnist at a time when very few women had advanced that far. So it was a big deal that they got married. He was 17, she was 41. And they were happy for some years, So Frank was a country boy. And Frank, when he was starting to get a plan, he wanted to do something with animals. He'd go to Lincoln Park Zoo, he'd talk to the people there, and he was getting a plan. He wanted to do something with animals. But he needed a place with more room. So where was he going to go? He was going to go on the outskirts of the city. He was going to go to a neighborhood called Norwood Park. And Frank and Amy found a house, that house. It's on Ardmore Avenue. And they lived there for some years, and eventually they got divorced. All accounts say it was an amicable divorce. And Frank went on with his career and became famous. And of course the house is still there, and it's a historic house. It doesn't have a mark of distinction. Don't bother people who live there because they might not know the history of the house. But anyway, there it is. Yeah. Okay, A Christmas Story. Everybody's seen this movie, right? Okay, Ralphie wants the air rifle for Christmas. Nah, you don't want that, you shoot your eye out. Well, those stories came from Gene Shepard. And Gene Shepard did a lot of radio work, TV. He always told these long stories, the kind of general stories about biting. Before there was Garrison Keillor, there was Gene Shepard, okay? And The Christmas Story was one of his stories. It was from a book called In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash. And this is the house where he grew up. This was in Hammond, Indiana. It's in Hammond, Indiana. Gene Shepherd was born in Chicago, grew up in Hammond, and eventually, you know, when he became an adult, he moved out of the house. He served in World War II. Years later, when they were going to make the movie, his brother showed up at this house. And his brother came to the front door. Nobody, you know, the lady in the house didn't know who he was, so she, you know, he wanted to look around. He, you know, scram and everything she told him. But this was his house in Hammond. It's a private residence. But even though Gene Shepherd, when he was alive, did not foster a close connection to Hammond, they still think have a fond. They know how to use his name. Let's put it that way. Every Christmas, there's a Gene Shepherd holiday festival. They have a library named after him, and I think they have a plaque on the Warren G. Harding School. But this is his house in Hammond where Gene Shepherd lived. Joe Louis. Joe Louis, heavyweight champ, 1937, 1949. He's born in Alabama, grew up in Detroit. When he died, he was a greeter in a Las Vegas casino after he lost a lot of his money. That was his job. But when he was heavyweight champ, he lived in Chicago. And this is the house, this is the building where he lived in Chicago. It's on around 4320 or something like that, the exact address, South Michigan Avenue. And this is kind of fun with this one. When I came down there to take pictures, I was going to take pictures of the house. And then when the man came out of the house, what are you taking pictures of the house for? I said, well, Joe Louis used to own this house. Joe Louis owned my house? I said, yeah, Joe Louis. Everybody knew who Joe Louis was. The son of a gun. So that's Joe Louis, is where he lived for at least 12 years on the south side of Chicago. There's no mark of distinction there or anything, but that's where Joe lived. This building is on Roosevelt Road around Central Park Avenue. This was the first great movie palace in the United States. This was the Central Park Theater. Before the Central Park Theater was built in the early 19-teens, movie theaters, they call them Nickelodeons. You're in the little room maybe this big, maybe even smaller, and they have a bed sheet up, and you pay a nickel, and they project the thing on the screen. Well, 1915, movie called The Birth of a Nation comes out. Horribly racist movie, but for its time, technically, miles ahead of the rest of the competition. Historic movie. Well, when The Birth of a Nation came out, the Balaban brothers, who had this little Nickelodeon on Kedzie Avenue, they decided, hey, the movies are going to be a big business. So they invested in this building, Central Park Theater, and they put air conditioning in. And of course, during the summer, a lot of people would just go down there and they'd pay it in the morning, and they'd sit there 6 hours through the heat of the day, and they'd stay out there. But this is the first great movie palace in the United States. And the building, this is the interior shot of the building in better days. The building was a church for many years. It's become kind of derelict. I haven't been down there for a couple of years. I don't know what the condition is now, but that's the Central Park Theater. Another movie. What movie is this? The Untouchables. Kevin Costner as Elliot Ness. Our focus is the building in the back. St. Paul Catholic Church. This is in 22nd place around the area around Western Avenue, Division in through there. And this building was designed to, the congregation was largely German Catholic then. And this building was designed to look like the Cologne Cathedral, the Canada Dome, because to remind the Germans of home. And it's an architectural landmark. And it's considered, they sometimes call it the house that was built without a nail, because it was built with all these traditional methods of building things. I don't know if, maybe they did use a few nails, but that was the legend about it. And that's still there, and the congregation now is largely Mexican, but it's still worth a visit in the area. St. Paul's Catholic Church, and of course St. Paul Federal Savings, which was a big savings and loan in the Chicago area for many years. They got it started in the parish. That was their building and loan in the parish. Now, some of the lost landmarks. This is the cover of the book. This is the old Peter Hand Brewery. And this was on North Avenue in Sheffield. And I took this picture in the 1970s when Meisterbrow was their brand that they had for many years. And the thing was, they kind of overextended. Meisterbrow overextended in the early 70s. They had so much advertising. At one time, you saw, Meisterbrow signs were almost as popular as Daily for Mayor signs, And, but they did overexpand. They had a program on at night. It was called the All Night Meisterbrow Showcase. They had a man named Franklin McCormick did this. And he did this on WGN. He would tell stories, he'd read poetry on the air. And one night, Franklin McCormick on the air, he had a heart attack. And he didn't die on the air, but they carried him off and he died shortly afterwards. It was kind of an omen. So Meisterbrow went out of business. I was bought by Pabst, I believe, or Pabst or Miller, I can't remember, Miller. Bought their labels, moved to Milwaukee. Then this old brewery was sitting there, was taken over by an experienced brewer, Joseph Huber. He ran it for a while. He came up with Old Chicago brand. That only lasted for a few years. And then they eventually knocked the building down, and there was a parking lot there. Another lost landmark. This is at Maryland Avenue and 57th Street. And this is where Ronald Reagan lived when he was in Chicago. Ronald Reagan lived in Chicago for a couple years when he was a young boy. Later on, it was by the University of Chicago, but the neighborhood was kind of run down then. And years later, when Reagan was talking to a friend, he happened to mention, yeah, I lived in Chicago, but I don't know where. I was only like 4 years old or whatever he was. So the friend decided he'd do some research. And he looked at all the old city directories and phone books, couldn't find anything about Reagan. Then he had an idea. President Reagan always was frank that his father had a drinking problem. So the friend looked up arrest records, and sure enough, Jack Reagan was arrested, 832 East 57th Street. So they found Little Gipper's home, and it was there, and for many years it was still rented, and every once in a while a Reagan fan would come by on pilgrimage. But then the University of Chicago was expanding, and they wanted to tear the building down. Well, the preservationists started talking about this, and maybe if by that time Obama was president, maybe Chicago already had a sitting president. So maybe if they didn't have a sitting president, or maybe if Reagan had been a Democrat, they would have saved the building. But they tore the building down, and that's a parking lot now too. Another thing for a president. This is on the west side, around Kedvale, and it's in the West Garfield Park neighborhood on West End. I believe it's on West End Avenue. I can't remember the exact address offhand. But this was built in the late 70s by Jimmy Carter. Carter, as you might know, was involved in Habitat for Humanity once he left the White House. This was one of the properties that they built in Chicago. He came here with Rosalind. They lived in the Guyan Hotel and on Pulaski and Washington, right in the neighborhood. And they built these townhouses on the corner over here. And the people were happy to have them. But unfortunately, by 2010, when I took the picture, the property had become kind of derelict, and the townhouses that Jimmy built were torn down. Another lost landmark, although this one I think is still there. It's just boarded up. This is in Englewood. This is on 62nd Place, 61st Place rather. This was the home of U.S. Senator Charles Deneen. And Deneen had been governor of Illinois. He was a U.S. senator. In the 1920s, Englewood was a booming neighborhood, okay? And he lived here in this house. And there was a primary in 1928. And Deneen was a Republican. He supported one faction in the primary. The other faction, was Mayor Thompson's faction. And the two battled it. So one night, somebody threw a bomb at the house here. And that was big news because, okay, those barbarians in Chicago, they're killing each other up, but you do not bomb the home of a U.S. senator. And there were calls that President Coolidge should bring out the National Guard or anything. Well, none of that happened. The primary went off without any more violence. Deneen's Slate got elected. 2 years later, he lost in a primary, and that primary was violence-free. This is where he lived on the south side. Now, getting near the end. This was my next book, Unknown Chicago Tales. And had a few things in here. This gentleman over here was famous in Chicago history at one time. I see if I can get the exact address of here where he was. Okay. This is Tommy O'Connor. Tommy O'Connor was a local thug. And he was captured by the police. This was in 1930, was it? Yeah. Well, this was in the 1920s. I haven't got the exact date. Anyway, he was captured by the police. He was sentenced to hang. But then he escaped. Okay? He escaped. If any of you ever saw the movie The Front Page, that's part of that. It's based on O'Connor's escape. Well, Tommy O'Connor escaped. And so a big manhunt went on for Tommy O'Connor. Where was Tommy O'Connor? And the legend started to build. You know, some people said he'd repented his wicked ways and he'd gone to become a Trappist monk. Other people said he went back to Ireland to fight for the IRA. There were sightings of O'Connor all over the place. But never found him. You know, he might still be out there. He'd be kind of old by now. But anyway, the thing about this was he had been sentenced to be hanged by the neck until he was dead, right? Well, a few years later, after he disappeared, Illinois got rid of the hanging, and they converted to the electric chair. But somebody decided, hey, if O'Connor's caught and he's got a smart lawyer, maybe he'll get off. So we better save the gallows. So they took the gallows apart and they put it in the basement of the county courthouse, which was then on Hubbard Street on the north side. That's where he escaped from. Well, a few years later, they built a new courthouse, 26th in California. Well, they moved the gallows over there and they put it in the basement there. Well, now years go by. It's in the 1970s. Somebody had heard this legend, and they wrote into this columnist in the Chicago American that did a column about strange things in Chicago. Ask him this question, and he did some. Ken Heist was the guy's name, the columnist. And he did some research, and my God, that gallows is still there. And so the story, you know, the gallows was finally after some years, they finally decided. They sold the gallows off. They decided they probably wouldn't see Tommy very soon. So they sold the gallows off. It's in a museum somewhere. And if anybody's interested in this story, you can do further research at the Institute for the Study of the Bureaucratic Mind. But by the way, if you do see this man, don't try to capture him. Call the police. This is Adam Worth. Or shall I say, this is Professor Moriarty. Adam Worth was, at the turn of the 20s, in the 1890s, he was a German-born gentleman who operated a string of, crooks in London and in England. And he posed as a society person, a society man, so he could get close to these people, and then his friends would go out and they'd rob people. Well, Conan Doyle was around at that time, and some people think he based Moriarty on Adam Worth because people at that time referred to this guy as the Napoleon of crime in London, and that's what, of course, Conan Doyle calls Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime. Well, how does Adam Worth figure in Chicago? Well, what happened was that along the way, his brother got in jail for some misdemeanor, and he needed bail real fast. Adam Worth's brother needed bail. So Adam Worth was still in London. He found out there was a famous painting, Georgina, Duchess of, I can't remember. Anyway, this famous painting was on display. So Adam Worth goes into the house, and he just goes in the house where the thing's being kept, cuts it off the frame, and he steals it. Well, it turns out little brother didn't need the money after all. The little brother got out. So Adam decided he'd keep the picture instead of trying to sell it. And he'd travel around with it all over the place. And then some years later, he decided he needed money for something different. So the people who owned the painting, the insurance company that was handling the painting, they put an ad in the papers and let it be known through the underworld, $25,000, which is what, $300,000-400,000 today, maybe $500,000 or more. No questions asked, we want the painting back. And so they negotiations were carried on by the Pinkerton Detective Agency at its headquarters in Chicago. And so they finally get word that Adam Worth is going to surrender the painting. And so a couple of, a detective and his wife from, an insurance representative and his wife come over from England. They got the money, well, they got a receipt, bank check for it, bank draft. And they go to the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and the Pinkerton chief says, oh, no, yeah, things are going fine. And they go to the bank, and the guy's going to cash his draft for the check. And the clerk looks at it and says, $25,000, that's a lot of money to carry around in Chicago. And the Englishman just kind of nods. The guy behind him, that's Mr. Pinkerton. Everybody knows Mr. Pinkerton. Oh, I guess you'll be okay. So they give him the money, and they go back to Pinkerton headquarters, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And finally, this guy comes out. And they got the money? Yeah, here's the money. Okay, here's the painting. They give him the painting, it is the painting, and it turns out this was Adam Worth in disguise. He'd given up the painting. But they didn't announce it to the newspapers until they got the painting safely back in England. Now, the kicker of this story is, some years later when Adam Worth died, his son decided he did not want to go into family business. So what happened to his son? He became a Pinkerton detective. So that's Adam Worth. Had to put a bowling story in here. 1914, Brunswick Bulky Collin and Company's got a new bowling ball. They decided they were going to send it around the world. You know, people didn't travel much in 1914. Most people didn't go further than 50 miles from where they were born. So they were going to ship this bowling ball around the country. They shipped it from Chicago to San Francisco, and then it was going to go around the world, and it would go from, they'd ship it from one YMCA to the next. This was the heyday of the British Empire. They were going to do it and get a lot of publicity. And they did it, and when it got over to Europe, there was a complication. It got to Europe in August of 1914, and a little scrap broke out called the Great War, World War I. So they had to change their plans. It wasn't going to go to Italy to be blessed by the Pope. It had to go a different route. And finally, it got to India, and then they wanted to ship it off to Australia. And they put it on a boat to ship it off to Australia, and the boat sank. Oh, terrible. The office, the Brunswick office on South Wabash, in the gloom, we went to all this trouble, but then they get another telegram a couple days later, no, the bowling ball missed the boat. It's still safe, it's still in India. So they put it on the new boat, and they ship it off. It gets to Australia and gets off to the World's Fair in San Francisco, and they showed it at the World's Fair, and then they put it in a warehouse, and they misplaced it. Well, 20 years later, they have the Century of Progress in Chicago. And they bring the bowling ball out, and they have the story told about the bowling ball that traveled around the world, and then they misplaced it again. It's in a warehouse someplace, like the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, where they got this big warehouse. Somewhere in a Brunswick warehouse, they got this bowling ball. Well, I give the exact serial number of the bowling ball in the book, so if you buy the book, or even if you don't buy it, you go to the library, check out that serial number. If you ever see a mineral lab ball with that serial number, you hold on to it. It's a piece of history. Okay. This is the last few things. Get 2 or 3 more, and then we'll end it. This is my next book, coming out in a few months. This one's called Authentic Chicago. It's more of the same, these weird stories. This is a view from the top of Thunder Mountain. Anybody know what Thunder Mountain was? Ski resort. Thunder Mountain was an in-city Chicago ski resort. At Diversey and Narragansett. This is Narragansett, that's Diversey, that's Taft High School. No, Steinmetz. I meant Steinmetz. Okay, I should know better. Steinmetz. But I did get to, and there's Scrudlands over there. Anyway, it turned out the Carey family had a brickyard there for many years. And then when they did close down their business, they decide what they're going to do with this land. Well, a couple of members of the family had done practice skiing. And, you know, after they developed the brickyard here, they had dug pits in it to get the bricks, and they could get the clay for the bricks, and they piled up a hole. So they got this big slope there. And so the members decided, the family was skiing down there, said, why don't we make it a ski resort? because this was 1967 after the big snowstorm in Chicago. You know, people were, you know, what are you going to do in Chicago in the winter? Well, you go out to Thunder Mountain. And so they built this and they opened it in 1968, and it was advertised as the only ski resort you could get to on a CTA bus. And they had grand plans for the future, but the weather turned bad, at least bad for skiing, good for everybody else, and they finally closed it down after a couple of years. And now there's a place called the Brickyard there, a shopping center. But before they closed it down, I managed to climb up to the top of the hill and snap this picture. So, and this picture's appeared all kinds of other places. Okay. Our Lady of Lourdes Church. This church was built on the east side of Ashland Avenue, near Leland, just south of Lawrence. And then the city decided to widen Ashland Avenue. So what are they going to do? They're going to tear the church down. It was only at that time, it was 15 years old or something like that. So the pastor got the idea, well, we'll just move the church across the street. And that's what they did. They put on rollers, moved the church across Ashland, turned it around. They did they expanded a little, and that's where it is. That's Chicago's Wandering Church, Our Lady of Lourdes. Now, I don't know what's happening now recently because they consolidated the parish recently, so I don't know if I don't think they're going to tear down the building, but I don't think it's open for worship at the present. And the last thing here. How many of you saw A League of Their Own? Movie? Right. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League during the 1940s, when the men went off to war, the ladies had their professional baseball league. Chicago had a local league, women's league. This one was called the National Girls Baseball League. And this one was a Chicago area league. Unlike the other league, the more famous one, this league continued to play softball. And they all had different stadiums around the Chicago area. Thilland's Stadium is one of the ones that's still standing. But they also had a place where I grew up. They had Rockola Stadium was at 4200 North Central, was where they played their games. And they were in business for some years. They had extra added attractions too at some of the games, the hype attendance. They had a group called the King and His Court. This was a male basketball team, softball team. And the pitcher was so dominant, they called him the King. Eddie Fegner, I think was his name. And he was so dominant that they would only put 4 people in the outfield with him, and he'd still win his game. And the other thing they had to try to hype the attendance, besides people want to come out and watch the ladies play, they had donkey baseball. Now the way that worked was this. The pitcher, the catcher, and the batter were, just stayed where they were. Everybody else had to be on a donkey. So the pitcher would pitch to the batter, or the catcher would catch it, and then the batter would hit the ball. If the batter hit the ball, if the batter wanted to run the bases, had to jump on the donkey. So needless to say, this wasn't what you call fast-paced, sports, but I tell the story of this league in the book. So that's Authentic Chicago is coming out later. So that's about it for now, and I'll take any questions anybody got or comments, and I wish I could turn this off because I don't want to wreck their power. Okay, we'll leave that on. Any questions?
So, excuse me, but we have 11 people on Zoom, and so for people that are on Zoom, if they want to hear their questions, either go to the microphone, please, or John, if you would repeat the question, one or the other.
Okay.
Respect for the people on the phone. So either go to the microphone, or I would ask John to repeat the question.
I need to take this out and listen to it here?
No, please, you can repeat the question, so please keep an eye. I've got another microphone over there.
Oh, okay. Yes?
I saw an aerial photograph of that stadium. I was so surprised to think there was a stadium there. It was a CTA aerial photo from maybe about 1950. And I was just stunned that there was this baseball stadium that had a covered stand so you could see the roof. And it was right there at the corner on Central. And you would not know going by there today. I think there was a Musket Hendrickson
Right.
drugstore.
I grew up in the neighborhood. There's a Musket Hendrickson over there. There was a National. Remember, National was a food store, and then the next block was a Jewel. We're talking about the location where the Rockola Stadium was at 4200 North Central. And you go to the neighborhood, as I said, I grew up around there, and most of the neighborhood is bungalows, but you can see the property that used to be owned by Rockola because that's late 1950s ranch homes when this closed down, and plus Luther North High School was over there, which has now been taken over by another group. So that was where Rockola played ball. And they had various other places in the city as well. It's going to be in the new book. Any other questions or comments?
If anybody on Zoom, excuse me, if anybody on Zoom has questions, please raise your hand if you know how to do that on Zoom. Otherwise, unmute yourself and speak up.
Oh, by the way, if anybody wants to buy a book, I have a couple of my books over there. Regular price is $22. You for the author's price at $18.
Okay, John, I want to we do have one comment online from one of our board members, Laura Banish. And Laura writes, please tell the author that the owners of the Frank Buck House are members of the Historical Society and it's owned now by Bernie and John Eshu. They are very aware of Frank Buck being a former owner. They're lifetime members.
Well, that's great. That is great. And as I say in my books all the time, most of these historic homes are, respected people who live there. Don't bother them. Unless it's a historic site, don't bother them. But it's good to hear that they know about Frank Buck, unlike Joe Lewis's descendants.
How many years have you been doing this?
Doing what?
Researching, historical landmarks.
Let's see, I'm 75. I don't know, since I was about 70 years or something like that. No, I grew up and my grandparents lived in the house downstairs, and they were always talking about the old days. And my grandfather was a precinct captain, so he was always telling political stories. And one of the stories that I wrote about, the book I did my doctoral dissertation on, was on William E. Dever. Dever was elected mayor in 1923, just going on 100 years. And he became mayor. He was going to reform the city. He built public works. He reformed the school district. He straightened things out. Everything there was no scandals. Everything came in on budget. The only thing was, it was a prohibition law, and he was an ex-judge, and he thought, prohibition's a silly law, but I got to enforce it. So he enforced the law, and for a while it worked, and they were talking about him as running for president in 1924. Well, that didn't come about, and by 1927, the people were tired, they were getting thirsty, the gang wars had broken out again, so he lost. Well, when I was a kid, 1959, 11 years old, I go to see this movie Al Capone, okay, with Rod Steiger playing Al Capone. Didn't look a thing like Al Capone, but never mind. And in the movie, this guy Dever gets elected in the movie, and Capone and the guys have to go to Cicero. And 4 years later, Big Bill Thompson comes in, Dever loses. He said, wait a minute, Capone was so bad, how come they voted him out? Brought Big Bill in. So I decided, I got to ask Grandpa about it. He ought to know. He's a lower level politician. So I asked him about Dever. He says, yeah. He says, Dever was honest. Trouble was, he wasn't a very good politician. And that kind of made a point to me in Chicago, maybe those two qualities are mutually exclusive. But that's William E. Dever. No, I started seriously. I started working on, as I told you, I got the landmark story in 78 when I moved in there, but I'd been working on a PhD before that. I always wanted to be a historian, and that's what I did. I did my one scholarly book on Dever, and now I do fun books, because I don't have to.
Very fascinating.
Thanks. Okay, any other questions, comments?
Some of the photographs were yours then, or?
Yeah, some of them are, some of them aren't. They're all, anyone I put in the book has to be public domain, or I got to get permission of the authors because I can't afford to pay the money. But the fortunate thing is this next book I got coming out, I got a nice picture of the Loyola University basketball team in 1963, which I got my bachelor's there, so they gave it to me for free. And I'm in the Union League Club, and so they were able to give me a few more pictures, like of Amelia Earhart, and then I got one Queen Marie of Romania came to Chicago, and that's a fascinating story. So I got a picture of her motorcade when she's coming into Chicago. So, but yeah, most of these pictures, unless they're historic pictures, things I snapped.
Got
Yes,
a little anecdote to tell you.
sure.
In 1924, over here is Norwood, at Nickerson and Nina is Norwood Crossing
Yeah.
today. It was renamed, it used to be Norwood Park Home, the old Norwood Park Old People's Home. And in 1924, they were building an addition onto the original building.
Yeah.
And Mayor Dever was out for the dedication, as was Herbert Hoover, who at that time was Secretary of Commerce.
Yeah.
And that's just a few blocks from here.
And it's interesting, you being a local in the neighborhood, you call it Nina, because most people call it Nina, but then, well, what's that street near Narragansett? Yeah, that'll confuse anybody if they don't know what's going on. That's another thing I wrote about once, Chicago's confusing street names, like Goethe Street, you know, I did one day when I took my high school gym at Goethe, it was whatever, I don't know. When I went to Germany, I'd speak to them in German, they'd speak back to me in English. So they told me I had an Irish accent for some reason in German, so I don't know, that was my grandmother. Okay, anything else? Oh, thank you, you're a great group.
All right, thanks a lot for coming, everyone. Thanks.